I learned about the house on the drive back from the hospital. Considering that I was weak and half delirious with fever, it seemed an odd time to tell me about my birth parents' final gift. But my grandparents were insistent. Maybe they figured that after such a close brush with death, there wasn't any time left to waste. I needed to know. My paternal grandparents had raised me, and they were the first people I called when I began feeling sick. The fever lasted for days, followed by tremors and hellish, paralyzing night terrors. The doctor's tests were inconclusive, but after a while, my temperature finally began to drop on its own. It had been a close thing, and when I heard my grandparents' news, it was hard to believe that I wasn't still asleep and dreaming. According to them, I had inherited a house. "We wanted to wait until the time was right," my grandparents explained. "And now we think it would be the perfect place for you to rest and recover your strength." Tired as I felt, I agreed with them. I didn't want to wait another minute. Fortunately, the house I'd inherited was just an hour away from the town where I'd grown up. At the end of a long gravel driveway, my grandparents' station wagon ground to a halt in front of a wrought iron gate. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a house. It was a mansion. A tanned, pudgy man in work attire ushered us through a gate with a wave of his hat. My grandparents rolled down their window, talking to him like an old friend. His name was Paolo, and he was the caretaker of the estate I'd inherited. With a short bow, he invited me inside. My grandparents said their goodbyes, assuring me that they would be back to pick me up as soon as I felt better. The plume of dust that their car raised as it disappeared down the gravel road felt as unreal as everything else around me, and I pinched myself as Paolo led the way across the perfectly mowed green lawn. Paolo warned me not to get my hopes up. The house itself had been in my mother's family for generations, but for tax purposes, it was owned by a private trust. The place badly needed updating, but the trust prohibited all but the most superficial of renovations. Paolo's complaints and chatter faded into background noise as I walked through the double doors and took the place in. Ornate wood-paneled walls, mosaic floors, stained glass windows in the custom-built windows. I didn't understand. I'd always believed that my birth parents simply hadn't had the resources to raise me. But this place was clearly worth a fortune. Noticing my confusion, Paolo explained that a 19th century millionaire had built the place for my great-grandfather Alexander as a way of funding his research. Apparently, my great-grandfather on my mother's side had been a sort of later-age Renaissance man. He'd owned almost nothing and lived on the patronage of the wealthy. Paolo's own great-grandfather, an illiterate Italian farmer, had been hired as a caretaker just 2 days after passing through Ellis Island, making the house as much a part of his family history as it was mine. I was winded by the time we arrived at the master suite. My sickness had taken more out of me than I'd thought. Seeing stars, I sat down on a real feather bed and looked out the window over the rolling hills, golden in the late afternoon sun. Smiling at my disbelief, Paolo reminded me that he would be in the caretaker's cabin if I needed anything. The house was well provisioned, but if I had any requests for food and drink, he could pick it up when he went into town. Almost as an afterthought, he added that I should ignore any odd sounds that I might notice after dark. These old houses tended to creak and groan as they settled into their foundations, Paolo explained, and rats sometimes invaded the attic. In any case, it was best just to stay in bed if I heard anything. After Paolo left, I kicked off my shoes, stretched out, and stared up at the canopy of the four-poster bed. My mind buzzed with unanswered questions, but my body was utterly spent. Even though there were still hours left before nightfall, I sank into a deep and dreamless sleep. When I woke, the room was dark. I reached for a light switch. Nothing. Apparently, electricity was one of the updates that the house so badly needed. The daylight coming through the windows had been so bright before that I hadn't noticed it. But now? I felt my way through the gloom to the bathroom. The house did have indoor plumbing, even though the toilet still flushed with an old-fashioned pull chain. I was just about to head back to bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My blood ran cold. This was no scurrying raccoon or creaking foundation. I pressed my ear to the door. The sound was soft, as though whoever was out there was barefoot and trying to keep quiet. The closest thing to a weapon at hand was a plunger. I grabbed it and flung open the door. The hallway was empty. I stood in the dark for a long while, listening, but I heard no sound apart from the rustling leaves of the trees outside. On my way back to bed, I noticed another strange feature of the house. None of the doors had locks, or any other way to secure them shut. Despite their elaborate design, they were no different from the free-swinging doors of a hospital. I climbed nervously back into bed, unsure what my new discovery might mean. When I saw the room by the light of dawn a few hours later, I felt like a fool. It was true that there was no electricity in the house, but Paolo had left a battery-powered lantern right on my nightstand. Then, when I stumbled out into the hallway, I noticed the gentle tick of the grandfather clock downstairs. It seemed perfectly reasonable that my fever-addled brain had mistaken its echo for footsteps the night before. Laughing to myself, I prepared some coffee and apple oatmeal in the well-stocked kitchen, and set out to explore the house. My great-grandfather's patron had been generous. There was a library, a conservatory, and a vast, empty room that might once have been some kind of laboratory. The books lining the shelves were a testament to his varied interests. They ranged from Slavic folklore to advanced surgical techniques, and everything in between. It was, however, difficult to discover exactly what Alexander had been doing for his fabulously wealthy patron. Paolo's answer of all sorts of things wasn't exactly helpful, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed that I'd never heard of my great-grandfather or his research. Still, I hadn't come to my family home to exhaust myself with doubts. I was there to recover from my illness, and despite its mysteries, the estate seemed the perfect place to do so. Disconnecting from the digital world did me good, as did the fresh air and solitude. My grandparents had dropped off 2 suitcases of my clothes and personal belongings, while Paolo made sure that the kitchen was well stocked with anything I happened to crave. Even so, I found myself eating and drinking less, instead spending more time walking, reading in the library, and investigating the strange old house that was my heritage. During the day, I felt like I was making progress. The nights, however, were a different story. Although it was probably nothing, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps that I heard during my first night at the estate. The lack of lighting in the ornate, high-ceiling rooms bothered me, as did the fact that there was no way to lock any of the interior doors. The weirdly stretched shadows cast by my battery-powered lantern reminded me too much of the night terrors that had accompanied my fever. In the worst of them, an emaciated woman in a white nightgown, with hollow eyes and a distended jaw that hung down to her chest, had pursued me through darkened corridors that didn't seem very different from those of the estate. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was just a gut feeling, but I dragged a heavy armchair in front of my door before I went to bed. On the third night, a heavy thump jarred me out of sleep. I rushed to investigate, then cursed when my big toe collided with the chair I placed in front of the door. The chair was undisturbed, so whatever had caused the sound must have come from somewhere else in the house. The adjacent rooms were empty, and below me was only the library. Lantern in hand, I hurried down the stairs and into the cavernous room. Nothing seemed amiss, but as I ran my hand along the endless rows of musty books, a thought occurred to me. Wasn't it possible that the eccentric millionaire who built this place for my great-grandfather had included some equally eccentric features in its design? A secret passage, for example? It sounded absurd, but when I inspected the shelves more closely, I realized that one stood slightly higher above the floor than the others. The mechanism was simple. Built into the side of the bookcase, it was hardly a secret at all. A gentle tug released the latch, and the bookcase swung outward. When I lifted my electric lantern into the darkness on the other side, I realized that it wasn't a passage at all. It was a room. Roughly the size of a closet, it contained a wingback chair, an oil lamp, and a series of journals ordered by date. Mesmerized, I took one down and began to leaf through it. It appeared to contain my great-grandfather's notes on some sort of project. Test subject identification numbers, age, height, calories ingested. I noticed that the numbers in the height column steadily increased, while those in the calories ingested column decreased, in some cases to 0. The subjects who didn't reach 0 were crossed off with an X. I wondered if they dropped out of the tests early or something. Hours later, I had gone through 4 of those weird journals, and was still no closer to understanding what my great-grandfather had been trying to do. Some of the pages featured sketches of bizarre machines. Others showed dosage charts or occult symbols. I was just about to give up and head back to bed when I noticed the darker-than-dark shadow watching me from the doorway of the hidden room. Whatever it was tall, and just beyond the reach of my tiny lantern's glow. I could vaguely discern the outline of long, stringy hair and an old-fashioned nightgown. If I held up my light, what else would I see? Sunken eyes? Hungry, distended jaws? For a long time, neither of us moved. And then, the door slammed shut. That's how I learned that at least one room in the house did lock. From the outside. Hyperventilating, I looked around the tiny space. There was no way out. And I began to suspect that whatever this place's original purpose had been, it hadn't been used for a study. It had seemed so cozy that I hadn't noticed the smooth, soundproof walls, or the drain in the concrete floor. It felt like a place where people had been kept against their will. And now, here I was, trapped just as they had been. I pounded on the bookshelf door, screaming until my throat was hoarse. Soon, I was leaning dizzily against the door, wondering why my feet looked blurry. I was going to pass out. The sight of a pedal on the floor jolted me out of my panic. Of course, whoever had remodeled the room would have changed the locking mechanism as well. When I leaned my weight against the pedal, the door swung open easily. I tumbled, panting, into the library. I was surprised to see that the sun had come up, and that Paolo was leaning against the banister, shouting my name. The caretaker claimed to have no knowledge of the hidden room, but he didn't seem very surprised to see me come staggering out of the wall either. Old houses have a lot of secrets, Paolo shrugged, before asking me if there was anything I wanted from town. I had considered asking him about the tall, tangle-haired figure in the nightdress, but the last thing that I wanted was for him to fear for my sanity. I reminded myself that I'd experienced strangely similar hallucinations during my sickness, and I was still a long way from a complete recovery. Besides, if the gaunt woman had been real, then where had she gone? I had no appetite for breakfast. Instead, I made several loops around the exterior of the house, trying to create a mental map of its windows, chimneys, and cellars. Just as I'd suspected, many of the rooms were much smaller inside than they should have been. It was like there was a whole separate house in the dead space between the walls. The strange, soundproof room that I'd discovered had been easy enough to access, but there was no clear way into the other spaces between the walls. For a crazy moment, I even considered smashing a hole in the plaster. But then I remembered the mysterious trust that managed the estate. If I damaged the property, I was sure to be sued, banned from ever returning, or worse. My head ached. The bright sunlight was starting to get to me. I investigated the cellar, where I didn't find much more than old gardening equipment, and dozens more of the small, thick-walled rooms, just as empty and mysterious as the one upstairs. By mid-afternoon, Paolo still hadn't returned. When he wasn't back by sundown, I began to feel genuinely concerned. And not only for the kindly old caretaker's health. Without Paolo's car and phone, I had no way off of the estate. Still weak from my sickness, just a few loops around the house were enough to wear me out. There was no way I could walk the length of the 2-mile driveway that led to the main road. Even worse, Paolo's absence meant that, for the first time, I'd be truly alone in the house after dark. And who knew what might come creeping out of its walls? With a deep breath, I sat down on my bed, wondering what I should do. Twilight had descended on the estate, and at first, I didn't even see the large leather-bound album on the mattress beside me. I hadn't put it there. In fact, I'd never seen it before in my life. Paolo couldn't have placed it there either. I glanced up, half expecting to find some horrible, less-than-human thing standing close enough to touch. But the room was empty. Running my fingers over the old leather, I wondered what the album was meant to tell me. There was a small black-and-white photo of a family of 5 in the center of its cover. I clearly recognized my own green eyes, sharp cheeks, and frizzy brown hair in their features. Fascinated, I opened to the first page. Although our patron has been most generous in providing test subjects, the gift of immortality is not one to be bestowed casually. Within these pages, I will document my family's journey into the next phase of human evolution. Alexander T. If the journals had sounded insane, the album's dedication was even more so, especially considering the first few pages featured nothing more than the same 5 people going about their daily lives, sharing a meal, reading in the library, and even lined up by height in the main hallway. After the 9th page, however, things began to change. The meals, I realized, were being documented because the people in the photo were being fed some kind of chemical. The dosages were listed across from each photo. The library photos were taken with increasingly less illumination, probably to show that. For the people in the photo, light was increasingly unnecessary. Likewise, the height images were used to show that the family's bodies were changing, far more rapidly than should have been normal. The changes were most obvious in the adults. Their arms and legs became stretched and gaunt, their eyes hollow. Their heads grew larger, and their jaws dropped ever lower towards their chests. In the meal photos, I noticed that the quantities of food and drink were becoming less and less. By the 15th page, the family wasn't eating at all. The library photos were nothing more than black, lightless squares, and the hallway height photos were almost too gruesome to look at. The children continued to look normal, which, in a way, was worse. For them, living with these emaciated, inhuman things was normal. I hoped they were costumes. I hoped it was a prank, a joke, anything. There were no more photos until the children reached young adulthood. Then came another series of charts: height, weight, food consumption, and fever. In the next photos, a few barely perceptible changes had already taken place. And more importantly, there were new additions to the family. Each of the original children now had a spouse and a child of their own. Those 3 relationships seemed too close to be a coincidence, and a chilling thought occurred to me. Had the children been ordered to find partners? To breed the next generation before they themselves began to change? The background of the following images was slightly more modern. Bushy facial hair and corsets were out. Tuxedos and flapper dresses were in. Behind those superficial differences, however, was a sinister repeat of the first set of photos. The adults grew ever more monstrous. The children were mostly unchanged. Until another set of charts. A 3rd generation had reached adolescence, and by now, the photos were in color. Beneath them, however, were the same measurements: height, weight, food consumption, and fever. This generation, too, had found partners and children of their own. One of those children was my mother. I almost didn't want to turn the page. I already knew what was next. The older generation would warp and change, finally retreating into the other side of the house. The younger generation would find partners, reproduce, and then gradually begin to change themselves. My father, it seemed, had hid me from my mother's family by taking me to my grandparents. He had broken the cycle, hadn't he? I thought about the fever, the lack of appetite, the headaches caused by sunlight, and I started to wonder, what if my grandparents hadn't brought me out here to recover? What if they brought me here because it was already too late? What if I'd been allowed to discover the secret rooms, the photo album, and my great-grandfather's work, all in order to introduce me to the changes I'd soon be experiencing myself? The footsteps I'd heard and the figures I'd seen were my own family within the walls, coming to check up on me, to see how I was progressing. I looked down at my fingers. Weren't they a bit longer and thinner than they'd been that morning? My heart raced at a sudden creaking sound from the bedroom wall. It was swinging outward. The blackness beyond beckoned. My heritage. My future. An eternity of lightless passages. "Come to us," my mother whispered from the darkness. "We're waiting." Hey guys, hope you enjoyed today's video. I just wanted to take a quick couple of minutes to talk about a project I'm involved with called Shadowbox Archives. It's a new community for fans of horror that lets you read and listen to stories for free. You can find stories written and narrated by me, as well as a lot of great other authors such as John Beardify, whose story you just heard. Check out patreon.com/Shadowbox Archives if you want to look for yourself. I also sat down for a quick chat with one of the creators of Shadowbox Archives, Victor Sweetser, to discuss it further. Here's what he said when I asked him the question, what exactly is Shadowbox Archives?
So Shadowbox Archives is a community that is a joint effort between authors and some artists as well for the posting of stories and art where we're more in control of the content. And on the audience end, all of the content is either free or becomes free after 7 days. So the audience doesn't need to pay anything to enjoy their time there.
I think that's an awesome feature of it for people who just like horror and are just a casual listener. Like, even if you've never joined a Patreon before, you can jump on there and start reading stories and listening to stories, and you don't have to pay anything.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
and I feel like there's the most people expect Patreon to be paywalled, but it doesn't have to be paywalled. And we don't consider ourselves paywalled, even though, sure, you can sign up for the premium audience-oriented perks and pay for early access, but you're not getting any more content you're not getting any more stories or art than someone who's doing it for free. You're just getting that ahead of time.
Yeah, you just get it a little bit earlier than, like a week earlier than everybody else, basically, right?
Definitely, yeah. And we're going to try to, everything. As I try, we will anything we can do with that in mind, which should be everything, where everything is basically becomes free at some point, which would probably be 7 days. We're not gonna, have people waiting for like a month or two before content unlocks.
Right. And so if somebody's looking to join the paid tier, what are the prices? What are the tiers looking like?
So the paid tiers, you've got everything from $1, which will get you Discord access to our Discord server, and we have a nice Discord server, and it will also get you a digital bookmark with artwork from one of our artists, one of our featured artists on Shadowbox, and also. That also comes with a quote from one of our featured authors. And then on the higher end, you've got the early access tiers. So the second tier and the third tier, they come with early access to featured stories and art, which unlock to the public in 7 days. But if you're paying those tiers, you get access to them right away. And also, our last tier comes with a mug that is proudly displaying featured art from one of our featured artists on the mug.
Yeah, it looks really cool. Actually, I think I might have to join the Archiver of Shadows tier for a month just to grab that mug.
Yeah.
But that leads into a bit of a segue to if somebody is a horror writer, and because I know there's a lot of people who listen to the channel who do like to write horror as well,
Hmm.
and who maybe would be interested in trying their hand at something like this. So, what is the process like for somebody if they wanted to write for Shadowbox Archives?
Okay, so we've got a couple options there. You could simply participate in one of the community activities. We have some community activities both in our chats, and also we have posts, what are called open box posts, where
Right.
anyone can share a story. You don't even have to be, as long as you have a Patreon account and you're a member, you can be a free member. All of that community content sharing is completely free. As long as you have a Patreon account, you can share excerpts of your stories, links to your stories, or to your artwork. As far as recruiting featured contributors whose artwork that we display on the main feed, we plan to recruit through events that are also going to be completely free and open within the community. And we'll have posts for that where people can basically, post their stories or links to their stories for the chance to get likes from the community also. And from that, we'll determine which individuals who are able to join as featured contributors. A lot of that we will try to leave up to the community itself. So, like, if a story that has been basically submitted for one of these events gets the most likes, that's the person we would like to go with as a new feature contributor, as opposed to us deciding, which can be a bit arbitrary. We're also talking about bringing in guest editors who have impressive editorial work under their belts
Okay.
to select pieces from the community for us to post on the main feed, and then from there we might recruit those individuals as feature contributors for Shadowbox Archives, and that would
Okay.
also double as kind of bringing a little more prestige to the community. Once again,
Right.
as opposed to us admins selecting, which is okay, but I think that whole process, I just think it's better when you put more control into the audience's hands, and also like in the case of bringing in a guest editor to make a selection, we're bringing in kind of um, an outside voice to make that decision, as opposed to the administrators making that decision.
Right. And so I'll just really quickly looking at like some of the featured contributors because I know some of these names will stand out to some people who listen to the channel. We got Renee Wren,
Hmm.
who's a fantastic writer who've been featured on the channel multiple
Yeah.
times. Uh, that really short chick who people might recognize on my channel from the Charlie's Department Store series
Hmm.
that I've been doing recently. Jesse Pullins, who we talked about a bit, who's a Hawaiian Shirt on Reddit. Fantastic author, very, very talented guy. Uh, yourself, I've got John Beardify, who's also been featured on the
Yes.
channel multiple times. Fantastic, very talented author. I don't want to leave anybody out, but there's also a lot of featured contributors, so I'm not going to
Yes.
name this off
A
everybody.
lot of big names, and it's a lot of legends from No Sleep as well.
Yeah,
Blair, I don't know if you mentioned Blair Daniels yet, but
Blair
Blair
Daniels for
Daniels,
sure.
for
Yeah,
example, who have massive followings on Reddit. And let's not forget about Jordan Group, who
oh,
is
thank you.
an amazing writer, and very thankful to have his work displayed on Shadowbox Archives. Just so many big names from No Sleep and Reddit.
Yeah, and those are just
It's
some that people might recognize. There's Alan
Yeah,
Wilson. There's a lot of a lot of
AKA Postmortem.
Yeah, aka Postmortem 3033, who's won
Yep.
more awards than I think anybody I'm aware of on Reddit. He's won like best.
Yes.
I don't want to list him off and get him wrong, but he's won like probably a half dozen awards on Reddit for different short stories he's done. Um, and we also have Biscuit Starberry, who's doing uh, um, illustrations and things like that.
Mhm.
So there's a lot to enjoy on the Patreon. It looks like
Definitely.
there's more to read here than you could go through probably in a month. So if somebody is looking to join, you want to give them the URL where they can go to join. Patreon.com/Shadowbox Archives, I believe is it.
Yeah, you got it down, and I should have that down.
No, that's okay. Just so people know where to go. And I'll put it in the description on this video as well.
Yes, the URL is www.patreon.com/Shadowbox Archives.
Okay, perfect. And anything else you want to let people know about the Shadowbox Archives?
Yeah, we've also got we're in the process of recruiting some more featured artists to join us, so there should be more art populating the feed as well to break up the stories, which I think is another thing that will make us kind of unique, as opposed to browsing through a subreddit that is only stories. We also have art. So we're in the process of recruiting some more artists. Also on the way is the Shadowbox podcast, which we're very excited about, which is going to be like true crime, real paranormal meets fiction. So
Nice.
we're going to really look closely and interview individuals who are involved in real crimes and quote unquote real paranormal. Is really something for the fans of true crime, real paranormal, and also creepypasta and fiction, horror
Nice.
fiction in particular.
I love that. I love some crime.
We are horror leaning. We do accept all genres, both from our featured contributors and in the community sharing of art and stories. But we are horror leaning, so the podcast is going to be more. It's going to be scarier, basically.
Okay, nice.
Or as scary as our scariest stories. Let's put it that way.
Okay, there are definitely some scary stories on Shadowbox Archives for sure.
Definitely.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting with me about this, and yeah, I'll be sharing this on the channel, and I'm looking forward to seeing some new people join Shadowbox Archives.
Thank you so much, Jordan.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.